with so much passion. So Lidia, I will leave it for you for now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I am Lidia Varesco Racoma of Lidia Varesco Design in Chicago. I am a brand strategist and a marketing designer, and I focus on working with nonprofits, associations, higher ed, basically organizations that are mission focused and looking to make a change. So I help clients with, everything from brand strategy to brand development, marketing design, and I do quite a bit of speaking. I've done quite a few talks with Keela, which has been great. I love partnering with Keela. I will be probably mentioning some of my past talks today for reference, because we've created some great collaborative references together here at Keela. So welcome everybody. I will start sharing my screen. Okay, great. So today I don't have much as far as a presentation because, we're going to be doing this in kind of a Q&A format, but I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview before we get started, just to kind of maybe help people sort of formulate questions or think about maybe something you haven't thought about prior to the session. So as Ishay mentioned, this is an Ask Me Anything about nonprofit branding. So I will be looking forward to hearing some questions. But just to give an overview of branding, this is the framework that I work with. So I basically think of it in terms of who, what, why, and then where. So who is your audience? Those are the people that you serve. What is the problem that you're solving, for this audience? And the why is the reason that your organization exists. And then the where are the ways that you express your brand. So we call those the brand touch points. So those are the different places where people interact with your brand. And now you might be thinking, why is branding such a big deal anyway? Why do we need to worry about it? Well, hopefully you've attended my other sessions and you know why it's important, and I'm very passionate about it. But there's several reasons. So one of them is that branding does attract attention to your organization. And there are quite a few stats. You will hear me share stats because I really feel that being data informed is important. And definitely, as far as for branding and marketing, we want to look at data, existing data, as well as data you collect with an app like Keela. So one of the stats that I really like is that color increases brand recognition by up to 80%, which is a really big deal. And that's why, we go through the trouble, us as brand designers, to choose colors very intentionally. And hopefully as organizations, you're using those brand colors intentionally. And it works. People will notice you because of that. And then the second reason is that branding helps to develop relationships. So another study here showed that, and this is consumer related, but I like to look at things from a for-profit as well as a nonprofit angle. But here they're sharing that 64% of people are citing shared values as the reason they have a relationship. And I would guess that this also applies to nonprofits just as well, because people develop those relationships because they feel that connection with you. And that's something that you can do and express in your branding. And then lastly, branding does increase donations. There's a study by Network for Good, which many of you may be familiar with. They put out studies quite regularly, and they showed that donors give 38% larger gifts to branded donation pages rather than a generic page. So again, it's something that it's been proven that branding does make a difference. So it's something that is definitely important to consider. So next, I have a short poll just to kind of get a sense of what your nonprofit's challenges, current branding challenges are. So I've picked sort of the 4 that I find, that are quite common. If there's something else that I haven't addressed, feel free to drop it in the chat. I know everybody has very unique challenges depending on who they serve, their audiences, what type of work they do. So yeah, feel free. I'll give you maybe a minute to enter in your answers, and then anything that's not on my list, you can put in the chat. So for now, it's looking like Making it strategic is the front runner, which I'm not surprised. I think that's where a lot of organizations, at least the ones that I talk to, they really want to have that strategy behind their branding. Okay, great. I think we've got everybody's answers. So it looks like, yes, the front runner was making it more strategic. And then we have a tie for improving and making it consistent, which is, I know in my experience, I've come across that quite often as well. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. That really helps. So as I mentioned, some of these are kind of the 3 top nonprofit branding challenges that I see in my work with clients. Multiple audiences. That's something that comes up quite often where, people are like, okay, we're trying to market to the donors, but then we also have, people that participate in our programs. There's, maybe foundations we're talking to, volunteers. So that's something that definitely comes up quite often. And that's part of that strategy that we'll talk about. And, and then consistency is another one that comes up very often. And I think that's sort of a branding and marketing challenge where you're maybe inconsistent in your branding as well as in your marketing. And that leads into staff capacity. A lot of times there just isn't the capacity to keep everything consistent and keep a handle on everything. So these are some of the challenges I see. Maybe you experience them in your organizations as well. But now we're going to get to your questions. So I will let Ishay take over from here and start putting some questions out, and I will be doing my best to answer them.
Amazing. So we'll start from the first question, which says, how do you balance 2 demographics that you'd like to target? We offer a pay what you can service that is beneficial to those with low income, but it is also of interest to people interested in sustainability, who are usually people who choose to pay for our services.
Yes. So as I mentioned, this is quite common. I would guess there probably isn't an organization that just has that one audience. I think most do have kind of multiple audiences that they are speaking to. So what I suggest is, thinking about that who, what, and why framework, go back to the who. So think about who your audiences are, who these multiple audiences are, and then start creating the audience profiles, the audience personas, as we call them, in branding. And that's where you really think about, you think about the demographics, of course, as it relates to your organization, but you also start to think about what their pain points are, what their challenges are, what maybe how they participate in other organizations, what inspires them, what motivates them. So you really start to kind of break it down for each of those audiences. So I, suggest starting with one, maybe the major one that you know the most about. And then you write everything down. I'm a big fan of documenting everything. That's why I love brand guides, because it's documented and it's easy for people to reference. So, thinking about everything and then documenting it, writing it down for each of those audiences is super important. And sometimes, when I work with clients, we even go so far as to create an actual persona, a person that is related to, and maybe we name them, give them a name or kind of a real profile, so that when you are doing your branding and your marketing, you really identify with that person. They're a real person to you. And that's really what you want to do anyway, because that's how people will relate to you when you speak, as if you're speaking to a real person. So in addition to the audience profiles, I also suggest looking at how you can adjust your messaging for each audience. So, people will sometimes ask me, well, am I changing my branding for each audience? No, you're not changing your branding. You're just changing how you use that branding in your messaging. So, ideally you will have that overall brand positioning, which encompasses the who, what, and why. And then you might just be tweaking it for how you are speaking to each of those audiences. So of course, speaking to a donor, you would have a different goal than speaking to someone that you might be approaching for your services. So you just want to make sure that you are speaking to them according to what your goals are, who they are, what their challenges are. So that would be your messaging. Then the third thing would be to start considering the differences in the digital channels, in the marketing channels. So, if you are speaking to your audience on Facebook, how would you be speaking to them as opposed to maybe the audience on LinkedIn? They would be kind of different audiences and then different kind of voice. So those are kind of the top three ways. So the audience profiles, adjusting the messaging for each audience, and then considering how you might speak to those audiences differently on the different marketing channels.
That's really amazing. I'm actually taking some notes to use for my own profit, because audience persona is always something that's very difficult, but always something that we actually need to have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, so the second question is, I would like to know your suggestions for developing a brand kit for organization with a small budget and lean staff.
Great. So brand kits, brand guides, I love. Those of you that have come to my other sessions, that I did a session with Keela on how to create a nonprofit brand guide. And I always, tell people that they need to have one for their organization. If they have one, they need to start using it. So, if we're talking about you have a small budget, a small team, I think that starting simple is the way to go. So look at what you already have, which would be, your mission, your vision, your values. Maybe you even do have some audience personas. So look at that. So that's what I call the organizational aspect of the brand guide. So I think that kind of makes it a little less daunting because most organizations have that already. So look at that first. Again, we're documenting, we're putting it in a Google Doc or somewhere where everyone can access it. And then the second part of it is looking at your positioning and your messaging. So that's where we look at that who, what, and why of your brand and the key messages that you want to put out to people. And that's, I usually, when I do this exercise with clients, we look at maybe 3 key messages. You can always grow that, but those are kind of the umbrella that your messaging will be built upon. So I like to start small. You could even have 2 or 3 is good to start. But that's something that's also really important to put in the brand guide, because that will keep everybody on the same path, when they're creating content, when they're developing marketing or communications. And then the last part of the brand guide is the visuals. So this is what we all kind of think of as our brand guide. So that would be your logo, the logo usage, the different variations of your logo, your color palette, be very specific about that. I always indicate all the color options from Pantone to CMYK to the Web Hex RGB colors, so that that everybody is using the right color. And then the typography. And that's something that's become really important. I think nowadays, as we're all very digital, because, if you're using Canva or you're using Microsoft, Microsoft PowerPoint, or using Google Slides, sometimes the fonts may not be aligned with what your brand font is. So it's good to look at, like what I do when I put together brand guides, I have print fonts and then I have digital fonts. So that's something that maybe you can easily get on Google Fonts or Adobe Fonts. And it still, it matches and aligns with your font. It might be slightly different, but it won't look so off-brand. If you're using something that is completely not like your brand font, we don't want that to happen. So start simple, first your organizational information and goals, then that positioning and messaging, and then finally the visuals. And like I mentioned, I put together what I think is a great guide with Keela. So it's on the website. Ishay, if you have that link, otherwise I do have it. I can share it in the chat. And please do check that out, because that would be a good guide to get started with a simple guide for your organizations.
Thank you. Kim would share the link in the chat now. So we do have a couple of questions coming. So we'll answer that, then go back to the ones that were submitted.
Great.
So Charlene said, what should be the main focus when rebranding a nonprofit? We have a very low recognition within the community and need to rebrand, but don't want to do anything that could damage the recognition we already have. So this is a two-part question. Should I read the second part now, or do you want to answer the first part now?
Let's talk about the first part, which is the rebranding. So when I see that an organization is rebranding, then that is a signal to me that there have been major changes to the core of the brand. So major changes, to the mission, the vision, maybe the services that you're offering. Maybe you've increased services. So, there's also what's called a brand refresh, which a lot of times organizations will do that when there is something that's maybe more of a minor change, maybe tweaking messaging, adjusting visuals. So with a rebrand, that's a pretty big deal. So with something like that, I would say the first part of it is to ask why. So why did your organization, what was the reason? Was there something that happened? Is it just a gradual effect over the years that made you decide to do that rebrand? Because I think that's really needs to be the first question that's answered is why. Why are we doing this and why are we doing it now? After that happens, then I think you need to start thinking about, what really do we need to focus on first? Are we looking at updating our mission and vision? Creating new values statements. Will we be developing new logos around this? And that's where, like you said, the attendee who asked the question, you do have to consider that brand awareness that's already been built up. So I've worked with some clients where, we've been in this situation where they rebranded, and then we had to take some steps to make sure that people realized that, okay, this is still us. We specifically, I worked on some fundraising materials. So we wanted to make sure that, okay, there's this new name, there's a new logo, it's still us, they changed their focus. So, hence their rebrand. But we took steps to make sure that people knew. So in the fundraising materials, it was quite clear that, this is who we are. You may have known us as this name. We made sure to put that on the outside of the address. We created kind of like a tagline, that said formerly known as, the other organization name, just so that people, when they get the envelope, they know right off the bat. Otherwise they might think, well, I don't know who this is, and they won't even open it. So I think that, like I said, ask why first. Think about, do we need a full overhaul, or do we maybe just need a refresh? And then lastly, start to think about some of the steps that you can take as far as maybe, giving people a heads up that, things are changing, so that they start to, think about it, think about how you might approach it in your fundraising, so there isn't confusion. So those would be my answers to the first part. So Isha, you said there's this part two to the question.
Yeah. So the second question, she says, what are some alternative ways to reach audiences who may not use social media, or those who do not have any online access?
Yes. So, that's always a challenge if your audience is not on social media. There's a couple of things. So I think that if there are truly not digital channels that you're reaching your audience, then you really have to look at the community outreach. Can you create those, community groups, task forces, that are focusing on a particular aspect of your organization, where they are getting out there, going out in the community and using real flyers. I have clients where they are going out in the community, they're printing flyers and they're bringing them to community events that they participate in. Or maybe they have a print brochure, a simple print brochure, like a 3-panel that they're using in the community. So that's something where, starting out, I think thinking about, again, our audience, who is our audience? Are we able to reach them digitally? And, maybe they're not on social media, but they're on email. Email is very big for nonprofits. So that might be something as well. So if they're not necessarily on social, they could be on email. And if you're able to also poll your audience, whether that's, in person, just asking people, calling people on the phone, doing email surveys. That's a great way to really start to get to know, where your audience is and how you can best reach them. And, like I said, I have a lot of clients that they are doing print. They're still doing their print fundraising appeals. They're printing out flyers and bringing them to community events. So I think, first and foremost, really getting to know your audience.
Amazing. So Christina said in the chat, LinkedIn, in my opinion, it's more geared towards professional versus parents, clients, your donors. How do you view LinkedIn in regards to the type of audience?
Yes. So definitely, I feel like sometimes that LinkedIn is underutilized by nonprofits just because of capacity. So, if you already have other social media channels, it's like, who has time for LinkedIn? But I feel like it's a good idea for nonprofits to think about it, depending on what your strategy is. So if you are looking to get donors, maybe more of the corporate donors, or a lot of times people turn to LinkedIn for volunteers, where you're looking to get that corporate volunteering type of situation, or even just, personally sharing it with your network. So it doesn't have to be, coming from the LinkedIn page. It can come from the executive director or somebody else within the organization that has, a pretty strong presence. They can be going out there and posting things about the organization, and getting it to people, just to the general public, to their network. So I think it's definitely something to consider. Like I said, I feel like it's a little bit underutilized, and LinkedIn does have a nonprofit kind of division. So they have some really good resources. They have somebody that, you can reach out to them and learn a little bit more about how LinkedIn can work with nonprofits. So I think it's worthwhile. I think that, like I said, I know that a lot of times it's capacity that keeps people from getting on other networks. But I think, based on your goals, I think it's worth doing at least some research to see if you might want to give it a try.
Amazing. Yeah, we're also starting to use LinkedIn more just to create the awareness. And it also really helps because people find me from LinkedIn to approach me about my nonprofit. So I'll say LinkedIn is actually pretty awesome, especially for like corporate givings. We've had so many people reach out to us via LinkedIn. So yeah, it's really is underutilized.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect testimonial for people to get on LinkedIn.
Yes, get on LinkedIn. It's amazing. Yes, so we'll go back to the questions that were submitted. It says, where should we start to standardize our branding and other marketing efforts moving forward?
Yes, so perfect segue. So we talked about the brand guide. I think, creating the brand guide, it can take time. It can take money, if you need to outsource. But I really feel that it's so worth it in the end because, I talk to people and they say, oh my gosh, I look at this thing like almost every day, just to kind of keep them on track when they're doing a lot of marketing and communications. So I think that starting with the brand guide, that's step one. That's where you really want to make sure that you have something, at least that simple brand guide to guide you in your efforts. And then after that, then you kind of go to the step two, which is to start creating some design templates. So, this would be, for example, pieces that you use often, so with my clients, a lot of times we end up creating marketing templates for, of course, their email communications, for their social media. A lot of times, like with my nonprofits, we'll create a couple of templates for events. They have regular events that come up. So this way they have templates and then they're not, making something that looks different each time. So, there's also maybe like flyers, maybe there's like a postcard that you send out regularly. So I think, starting with the brand guide and then building on that by creating these templates in applications that everyone can access. So creating some really nice, strong email templates that have everything there. It's got a nice header, it has the section headers, and then whoever is creating and sending out the emails can just go in and put in the content, makes it very easy. And then the other types of marketing templates I usually will create for my clients in something like Canva or Adobe Express. And the nice thing is that those apps have what's called a brand kit. And that's where you can store your logos, your colors, your fonts. And this way, anyone from your team that goes into Canva or goes into the Adobe Express, that they will be choosing the right color, the right font, so it will look on brand just by the nature of, they're using those brand assets that you've selected and assigned. So brand guide and then creating design templates. I think that's, kind of the first steps to really create that consistency in your branding and your marketing.
Yeah, amazing. I will definitely be taking that and creating, especially the digital versus print font. I noticed that a lot of the times when I go on Google and try to use our brand font, I just cannot find it. So we have to use something similar, but that makes sense to get one that is just digital and purely print. Amazing.
Yep, definitely.
So the other question says, how can one convince their executive director to put more energy and resources into building a brand when it's currently good enough?
Yes, this is a good one. I know I talk to a lot of people that say like, oh gosh, like we really want to, refresh our brand or change things. And we're having a hard time, talking our leadership into it because maybe it's just been around for a while and everybody gets comfortable with it, or maybe they just don't see the value in it. So what I would say first and foremost is looking at data and statistics. And, as I mentioned, I'm really big on that. I always sprinkle in, data points in my presentations because I think it's really important. And this is an area where it becomes super important because, like I said, like sometimes you might need to sort of show the value, of doing this. So for example, I had that recent stat, or that stat that I showed about branded pages getting higher donations. So maybe your executive director doesn't know that, that's not an everyday, thing. It's, people like me that read all these reports. I kind of pull all these data points. And I am putting together a blog post that will have kind of the compilation of some of these key stats, that I've shared over the years in my webinars, because I think it is super important, that's kind of to see that proof that, it is worthwhile to spend time and staff capacity and money on branding. So, sharing some of those key stats, like I've shared with you here about branded pages getting higher donations. There's also a stat about, that people tend to use social media, and email encourages them to give. Those are kind of the top two, rather than maybe like, something that comes in the mail or a phone call or other, ways of reaching out. So, looking up, finding some of those stats. And there are organizations that put reports out yearly. So Network for Good puts out a report. I know on my blog, I have some reports. I like to kind of, when a new report comes out, I like to summarize it. So you can always take a look at my blog, and then, search nonprofit marketing reports or, something of that nature. And you can find some great, really great data that you can share with your ED and, just to kind of show them like, look, it's working. Other organizations have made an effort, put effort into their branding, and it's worked for them. I have personal testimonials, from clients that I've worked with that have said the same thing, like, wow, we really, put an effort into branding this campaign and we got, our highest, number of donations. So there's also kind of that anecdotal data. I think it's worthwhile maybe chatting with other nonprofit professionals. I know that like in my, I'm involved in a couple of nonprofit Facebook groups, and those are really a great place to ask people like, hey, what results did you have? Like, I really want to share some, good stories with my ED. So I think reaching out to people, getting those reports, that you can find online pretty easily, or, I can help you find some of those reports. And then the last one would be, see if you can try kind of a smaller initiative, something that you maybe have been thinking about, something that's very targeted and strategic, and then follow the analytics. If you're doing something online, see how many people are going to your page, your donation page, or see how many people are going to your website, or, people that are commenting on the Facebook posts. So see if you can maybe start with a smaller initiative and show the actual results. I think that's something that I will tell, people in my webinars and my clients. Keep an eye on those analytics, try to look at it monthly, look at your Google Analytics, look at all of your social media analytics, which, it's pretty easy. Even if you don't have an app that manages all the analytics, it's pretty easy to go into Facebook, into the Meta Business Suite, and see what posts were popular last month, and start keeping that somewhere, even a simple spreadsheet. I have one. If anybody needs it, you can reach out to me. I have a pretty simple digital analytics spreadsheet, and track those things, and, keep an eye on it for a couple of months. 6 months is probably a good period of time to really have, something that you can show. And then you can show, the ED or anybody else, maybe like, okay, so we did this social media campaign and we got great engagement and people were, commenting, or we drove, 10% more traffic to our website as a result of this campaign. So I think, like I said, trying a smaller initiative and then watching results is super important, just to do in general, on a monthly basis.
I love that. Also, if you could send us over the digital analytics template,
Yep,
so I can add it to the follow-up email so everybody gets that resources, that would be amazing.
I will definitely.
Awesome. So we have our next question here, which says, how long do you think it should take ideally to sync up branding standards with an already existing but disorganized organization?
Yes. And I would say, I'm not sure if whoever asked the question, if you're here, I would like to ask you a question. Do you have brand standards now? Or is this a situation of creating from scratch? So if you're here, you could drop it in the chat. Let us know, because it sounds like, it kind of sounds like maybe there are brand standards, but they haven't been used within the organization. So if that's the case, it may not be as daunting as it seems, because it would really be a matter of, okay, let's pull out that brand guide, that apparently nobody has really looked at or hasn't had time to look at. So let's pull out the brand guide. Let's pull out all of our marketing materials. And this is where I suggest to people to literally spread it out on a table. So even your digital touch points, the ways that you reach out to people digitally, even those, I would say, oh, okay, I just see, John, if that was your question, you're starting them from scratch. Okay, well, I'll address that since I already got started. If you do have brand standards and you're just kind of trying to get more aligned, print everything out, put it all out on the table, look at it against the brand guide, and then you'll very quickly see, where there are gaps in your branding, where you maybe need to improve things. So that's what I call a brand audit. And that's something that is really simple to do, and, to look at everything and kind of compare it. And like I said, it's most helpful when you put it on a big conference table and you see it all at a glance. But see, now that John jumped in and said they are creating the branding standards from scratch, so that'll be our second scenario. So for something like that, if you're just doing the audit, you could do that in, over the course of a week. You could kind of look at everything, sort of assess everything. If you are doing a brand guide from scratch, I think something like that, you would want to allow a few months to really do the brand exploration. So that, that would be like, really diving into that who, what, and why of your brand. And that's something that I do with my clients. We usually do a couple of sessions, before we might do it in person on a board. Now we're doing it online in some sort of collaborative board document. But with something like that, you really want to make sure that you can first of all, pull your team together. So everybody that is kind of an important, member of the team or stakeholder, make sure they all put their input. Not too many people, but the key people. And then you really want to break it down and, think about that who, which is the audience. Think about the what, the problem that you're solving, the services you're offering. And lastly, the why. And the why is where I really see kind of the aha moments. Also in the who, it's interesting. A lot of times organizations are like, oh my gosh, we had no idea we had all these, stakeholders that are really, important, and we haven't been reaching out to them. But the why is, I think, where the magic happens, where you start to see, oh yeah, this is why our organization exists. And this is really, where our story lives. So, with something like that, John, it's definitely a larger investment in time and possibly money, if you're needing to outsource someone to help with that, which in my opinion is useful because a lot of times, having that outside opinion of someone who isn't really super knowledgeable in the day-to-day of the organization, that really helps, I think, to kind of uncover some of those things that, people may not have thought of. So yes, so I would allow, at least a couple of months to kind of start to develop that, depending on how much you have. With some organizations, maybe you have that audience data and it's somewhere, like you said, oh, it's disorganized. Maybe you can find it, so you can kind of get a head start on that. So I would say do as much research as you can. What can you find that's already existing within the organization, and then see how that kind of fits, within that who, what, and why, and allow, give people time. I think it's nice, when I do brand strategy sessions, it's usually, at least 2 hours, and people block out the time and they know that they're going to be dedicated to those 2 hours to really think about it and focus on it. And it really does, it makes a big difference. I think that, most nonprofits, time is really of the essence, and, setting aside that time helps to really get to the core of the brand.
Amazing. Thanks for the answer. Jen says, thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you were here.
So the other question says, when your organization is in need of a brand refresh, including updated mission, vision, values, website, and key messaging, where do you start, and at what point should we engage our board?
Yes. So, we kind of touched upon this a little bit earlier, sort of talking about the differences between the refresh and the rebrand. And in my opinion, I think this situation, I know that they're asking for a refresh. I think in this situation, this is really more of a rebrand. When I see mission, vision, values changing, that's the core of the brand. That means that something has really changed in the organization, and we want to address that. We want to look at that. So I would say, as far as involving the board, I think that's really important in that mission, vision, values conversation. I think that, once you start kind of rolling it out and you're looking at what are our key messages, how are we maybe changing our visuals, they mentioned their website, at that point, I don't think that the board needs to be involved, because that's really more of the execution of that brand strategy, that brand positioning. But I think, like I said, and again, if you're here, you can feel free to put more information in the chat, but it sounds to me like something pretty major changed in the organization, whether that was leadership, whether that was realizing that we have a new mission. Visions don't change that often because that's really more of a long term. But, with COVID, with the pandemic, a lot of things have changed for organization. I've seen people say like, gosh, we do have a new focus, because we've realized that we need to serve, now we need to serve people in a different way, because of COVID and how things changed for our audience. So I would say, if you truly do need to change that mission, vision, values, have the board. Maybe it's not the full board, maybe it's kind of key people that are really involved or knowledgeable of those parts of your organization. Because again, I think it's helpful to have the key stakeholders, have key people involved. I know that when I've done strategy sessions, we've brought people in from, different areas of the organization. And there's always kind of that enlightening moment where, they may not have realized this because they weren't involved in it. They were doing something else day to day. So I think it's good to have as many different, views in that stage without it getting to the point where nobody can agree on anything. And, I think most people internally, you kind of know, okay, who do we need to have in this strategy session, in this discussion, so that we know that we will get the most well-rounded, outcome. So, keep the key people, don't let it get too big, because then that can lead to other problems. And as I mentioned before, try to have a facilitator. This can be someone internally or, someone from outside the organizations, because you really need that person that is sort of neutral. They're not, I think this is where conversations can get heated and sort of off track, because people they have an affinity, for the organization and the brand as it is now. And it can feel sort of, personal if people are like, this is terrible, we don't want this anymore, so somebody who's maybe been involved for decades, they can take that personally. So I think that it's a good idea to have someone who can remain neutral, can keep the conversation, on task and really sort of goal and strategy focused. Keep it from getting personal, like, no, I don't like that color, I don't like that word that you've suggested in our mission statement. So having the facilitator, I think, is key. And if you do have someone with an outside perspective, they can also maybe see those connections or discrepancies that your internal team hasn't noticed because you're so close to it, so focused day to day. So yeah, great question. Another great question.
Amazing. So we will take one question, then we'll go to another question from the audience. Says, what are the biggest priorities for our brand? We're not very forward facing, not on social media, don't have a newsletter yet, but what do you suggest are the minimal things for our brand?
Yes. Oh, I love this. So first of all, research. I think seeing what research do you have currently on your audience, who they are, how you can reach them, where you can reach them. That is such a key component, is knowing like, how do we find them? Where do we reach them? And we kind of touched upon this earlier when somebody was asking like, well, what if they're not on social media, So I think that's the key thing, is looking at, what kind of research do you already have? If you're using a CRM or, something that you're tracking that audience, that's super helpful, to run those reports and really see, how are people engaging? I think that also, again, going back to that research of, data and reports, I'm not sure if I had this in my presentation, but I know that the Global Trends in Giving report, which is one that I look at every year, they have found that donors say social media and email marketing are the top two ways that inspires them to give. And I think over the years, it's kind of flip-flopped, 1 year it's email, 1 year it's social. But that's a really good indicator, because if the majority, these nonprofits that are responding to the reports, then that's a pretty good indicator that might work for your organization as well. So I would say, kind of thinking about those two, because we know that, people have said that works for us. Think about those two and how can you do them I know that this person that asked the question, they said, we're not on social, we don't have a newsletter. So how can we do this within our capacity? Well, you can, most of the email marketing applications have nonprofit discounts. You can get started kind of slowly, create something that's pretty simple. Again, most of the apps, Constant Contact, MailChimp, most of them have templates that you can kind of start with. And then I would also say, look at social media. And if you don't have any data existing, obviously, because you're not on social, just kind of, start look at maybe other pages that are similar to yours. And, are people engaging? How are people engaging? Just kind of follow them and see what they're doing and get that, intel, that might inform your organization. And then maybe start with one channel. So if, and now you would be looking at, like we talked about LinkedIn, LinkedIn is a little bit more of that kind of business audience. Then there's Facebook, everybody, I think most people kind of know Facebook, a little bit of a general audience. Instagram, which is a little more of that visual audience that kind of, wants to see those visual stories. And then of course, you have like TikTok and Snapchat and like places where younger audiences are found. So, I think just hanging out on those channels and kind of observing nonprofit behavior on those channels can be a good indicator for your organization as far as maybe where should we start. And I think starting with, an email newsletter that's pretty simple and maybe one social media channel, I think that's probably enough for you to get started since you're sort of starting from scratch. And then, like I've said, with other questions, like look at the data, any of the email applications that you might use, they would have, really good reports. So you can see how many people opened it, how many people clicked, and most importantly, where they clicked. You want to try to direct them to your website or your donation page. Did they click to that page? Did we get them through to the, our ultimate goal? So start small. It seems very daunting, I know, but if you just start with, an email template, maybe that you send monthly, even quarterly, if you didn't have the capacity just to get started, and then maybe one social channel after you've done your research, I think that will help you to then grow and see, where else do we want our brand to be? But I guess I should backtrack since this person asked, biggest priorities. First priority is, of course, like thinking about that who, what, and why. So just to backtrack a little, think about that first, kind of really get to know who that audience is and what that story is that you're telling. And then that does actually help you decide, where on social media you want to be, because, like I mentioned, Instagram, it's very visual. Obviously, you can't really post anything without a visual. So if you're, in kind of looking at your brand, you realize like, yeah, we are really visual. Like we've got all these great pictures from our events and, like we could do some great storytelling. Well, then Instagram's your place, and that's where you would maybe want to start. So starting out with the who, what, and why, and then picking maybe 2 digital channels that you can easily start out with.
Amazing. So we have one from the one that was submitted, then we'll take the 2 that just came in from the audience right now. So it says, how can we make our website donor friendly plus aesthetically pleasing? How can we identify our target market?
Yes. So, we've been talking about it all along, that who, what, and why. So that's, to identify your target market, that's that who portion, of your brand framework. So that's where you really, think about those audience personas, you look at your data, who you are working with now, engaging with now, and surveys. If you're able to do surveys of your audience, it is so important and it is so enlightening. And for example, one of my clients, they did a survey of their donors, and they found that, there was an aspect of their organization that they hadn't been sharing, in their branding, in their marketing. and, for whatever reason. And they found that some of the donors were like, oh, well, we know, we noticed that you used to talk about this and now you don't anymore. And, some of them were like, we really are considering withdrawing, we don't want to donate anymore because we feel that your organization has changed, or, something to that effect. So that's really important information. So I think that if you can do some of that surveying, or if you even have surveys that, you can look at and reference, or you can ask people, I think that's first and foremost, is really to kind of, assure that you are putting out there what your brand is all about, and like in this case, they were like, oh, wow, well, we need to address that. We need to figure out how we want to address this. So the other part of it is the why. So, that's the reason that your organization exists. And that's where you start to do the storytelling. And that's the part that really resonates with people. When they read a story or they hear a story, if it's something that they can relate to, or it's something that just in some way emotionally connects with them, that's going to, first of all, make them interested in your organization, and then make them want to, follow along and eventually, hopefully, become a donor. So how this looks on your website, since, the question was kind of about the website, is imagery. So, imagery is super important. I think making sure that you can get images of the work that your nonprofit is doing, one way or another, whether you're actually, have a photographer, or people are taking photos, that you can then use. I know that sometimes people do have to rely a little bit on stock photography, but the main thing is that the images are, in addition to being engaging, that they're really authentic, and they're telling your story in an authentic way that really relates to your audience, so that you're not just picking random images, or that you're making sure that the images are being respectful to your audience. There's a lot to really consider when it comes to imagery for your website. So that's another part of it, the storytelling, and then finding imagery that resonates, that, people connect with and can relate to. And then the third part of it would be give them a reason to keep engaging with you and to come back. So whether you have a section that is like, new things that have happened in our organization, or you have a blog, that's updated regularly, or you have a resource page, or, click here for new volunteer opportunities. Like, there has to be a reason for them to come back. You don't want them to come to your page once and never visit it again. So your website does need to be kind of this living, breathing thing that somebody is updating, somewhat regularly. You don't have to do an overhaul each time, but maybe update, the news section, or update, put up a new blog or some new volunteer opportunities. So that's really, the way that we, not only is it aesthetically pleasing, as the person had asked in the question, but you're giving them a reason to come back. So hopefully I feel like that was quite a heavy question with a lot. So hopefully I answered that.
I think you did, but hopefully you did for the person. You did for me.
Good.
So
I'm glad.
we'll take some of the questions that have come in. So somebody asks, any tips or ideas for a successful lead gen campaign?
I'm sorry, what type of campaign?
Lead gen campaign.
Oh yes, lead gens. So this is, again, like we were talking about, people coming back. We want them to have a reason to visit your website. So yes, lead gen campaigns are great. I think that everybody, at the minimum, you should try to have some sort of opt-in on your homepage that is a little bit more robust than just join our email list, because most people nowadays are like, oh, I get so many emails. Like, why do I want to join another email? So if there's a way that you can give them something, most of the time it might be just a one-page freebie, or some special resources that everyone doesn't get. That's something to really kind of think about and brainstorm, what do we, what knowledge do we have that's really useful, that people would really find useful and interesting, that we can get them to sign up on our list. The other way that, so that's a pretty easy one. That's maybe, on your homepage. There's also, lead gen campaigns through social media. So you might want to create an ad that is, very specific, and it leads to a landing page. And once they get to that landing page, they enter in their email address, and then they can get, whatever it is you want to give to them, a white paper, a report. There has to be some reason, because, people nowadays don't want to just sign up for a list. They want to make sure that they're getting something in return. So I think that's something that's really important to think about, as far as what would your audience, want, the people that you want to bring to your list, because the goal of a lead gen campaign is to get that ideal audience, to your website, to your email list, to get to know you. So again, we're going to backtrack, and we're going to think about that who, and who is our key audience. And, if you find that, okay, we really want to try to get more donors, maybe there's something, you put together something that would intrigue those donors, or if your lead gen was more volunteer focused, then, something that's, ways, to be a great volunteer, so I think thinking about who the audience is that you want to attract, what would they be interested in? And then you create the piece, and then sort of the back end, which is, are we going to have a landing page? Are we going to do a social campaign around it? And then that's sort of based on capacity and budget and all of that good stuff.
Amazing. So we'll take our last question. I know we're at time. It says, our board has asked us to increase our brand awareness in the market. We're a social service agency with dozens of programs and locations with different service ranging from housing and shelter to financial empowerment to educational and behavioral health services to foster care. Many audiences.
Yes.
Should we develop a brand awareness strategy for each segment? We can't afford a whole market consumer branding campaign.
Right. Yes. Again, we're going back to that challenge of like, oh gosh, all these multiple audiences. I think that, as we discussed, really thinking about those audiences, documenting the personas, for each of those audiences, and then seeing what the goals are for each of those audiences, right? So like donors, obviously, we want them to donate. But let's look at the other audiences and, what is the goal? And is there some kind of some crossover, between the audiences? Because maybe you can market to a few of those audiences in the same way. Maybe there is that common thread that allows you to market to two of those audiences, kind of in a similar way. I think that this is also where having really good, marketing templates and kind of a strategy is helpful, because you can say, okay, we've realized, we really do have like 5 separate audiences we have to talk to. So let's make a template, for each one. Like, we know that for our donors, we'll be sharing maybe, some impact. So maybe that's like an infographic, and we'll send, put that out on social, on, LinkedIn. And then maybe for this other audience, for volunteers, we want to share kind of volunteer stories. And that's kind of a separate template. And that's going out on Facebook. So I think, kind of thinking about all those audiences, thinking of the goal for each audience, thinking where there might be connections that you can take advantage of to make your life simpler, and then sort of sketching out, what sort of, template can we create to reach out to this audience? Or, email marketing is like the easiest way to market to multiple audiences, because you can literally use the same template. I mean, if you have crossover in audiences, they would get the same, the same look, but hopefully your email list, you clean it up, you make sure that you don't have people on different lists. So, I would say really think about email, because that's probably your easiest way to market to all of those audiences. But then also in social media, thinking about how can we create kind of a theme or a template for each audience. And that's what we focus on when we do our outreach.